Well, hello, friends, and we certainly do hope that you're enjoying the study that we're going through and the sessions that it presents to all of us. Now, we know that over time, questions may come up, observations, and or even statements that you would like to share with us, and we wanted to introduce to you a means by which you can make contact with us, and that is through email at billw@cgi.org. That's billw@cgi.org. We would love to hear from you to help us out as well, because so often, we get into a mindset perhaps and are not aware necessarily of things that are crossing your mind as a result of the material that we may be covering. So don't be shy, don't be bashful, don't hesitate if indeed a question may emerge through the presentations that we share with you, and go ahead and just email us at this billw@cgi.org email address, and we will get them and hopefully over the ensuing weeks be able to address some of them, even perhaps subjects that you would like to see us address. We'd be more than happy to take some of those ideas and maybe build presentations around them. So one more time, billw@cgi.org if you have any questions or statements or observations to make, and we'll look forward to receiving those requests from you. So in the meantime, let's now get back to the study that we're going through. It is a time, are we not, in embarking in this subject that we started on, which is health and wellness, realizing very much so that that's on our minds a lot, is it not? And we embarked and started this particular presentation last week in part one to address some particulars. And we started out and commenced in some particulars that we went ahead and mentioned throughout the course of that opening segment, of which I mentioned to all of you I needed in order to continue to set this subject up, because frankly I have not formally introduced to you, as we would say in Spokesman's Club, my SPS, my specific purpose statement. So I've been kind of just taking all of us along this journey, as I said it was going to be, and addressing some things along the way as though we're in some kind of a vehicle looking out the window and addressing issues in the course of unfolding this particular presentation. And it is on our minds, health and wellness, needless to say, because we have, in the environment we're in, we find ourselves in a centralized environment of health and wellness that is being fueled by what we've been led to believe, a pandemic, a flu pandemic, from complements of the CCP virus out of the what appears to be, and evidence is growing, Wuhan laboratories over there in China. Remains to be seen, but nevertheless, certainly indications seem to indicate very clearly that that's perhaps where it originated from. But again, as I say, in this particular case, it has been exacerbated by, and I think we're all viewing much of what is going on around us, of mandates that are being placed upon us. We have people here in our audience where their jobs are at risk. I'm sure we have those of you on the internet that are at risk in losing your jobs. Thousands of people, brethren, are protesting against this infringement, encroachment of freedom of choice over the coercion of forcing people against their conscience to do something that they don't want to do. It's that simple. And so thousands are raising their voices up in the streets, protesting, marching back and forth. You see them in all kinds of major cities, mixed in now also with other types of protests, like last night in New York City, protesting this verdict that came down for the young man who, came out on top, so to speak. But that's another story. I'm not going to digress. I don't have the time with that. But my point that I want to make in this case is that much of the environment that we are in, and people do not want to accept this for its legitimacy, but there is legitimate reason, brethren, there is legitimate reason to be concerned about the differences of opinion that are exacerbating the wellness and health of some who are refusing to go along with the public or more dominant narrative that is what you could say not exaggerated, but magnified by the multimedia and the mainstream press. And the reason I say that is because it's legitimate in this sense, that there is definitely conflicting information that merits our attention for investigation. So health and wellness is a very important topic, especially, and all I'm saying is in the environment we find ourselves in today. And so we've embarked on this journey. Yet last week we went ahead and we mentioned a couple of things that I wanted to just kind of reiterate here for memory's sake, that we established a premise. And that premise was that we, you and I, are the temples of God, and therefore have an incumbent responsibility to take care of these temples. It's important. God expects us to take care of both sides of the coin, not just the physiological, not just the physical, but also the mental and emotional conditions of our bodies. Because the emotional and mental conditions of our bodies can indeed bleed over if we're not careful with stress, with worry, with anxieties and sorts, to bleed over into the physical and cause physical maladies such as high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney failure, all kinds of things. We are interconnected in that way. And health and wellness is a very important realization and aspect that all of us need to recognize. We were also exposed to the statement of the Systematic Theology Project. I'm not going to belabor what that document is. I'll just reference going back to part 1, and you can see what that document is. But it said and made it very clear that doctors and hospitals are okay. They're good. They are wonderful assets in this modern day of technology that we have to take advantage of these technology. I referenced, if you remember, the operation I had on my meniscus. And I don't even have a scar there anymore. It was only 10 months ago. And all they did was drill a little hole, cleaned it up, and guess what? I'm running again. And why is that a big deal to me? Because I wanted to run. And the first doctor told me I needed to get a bike. I'm too old to run. What? You know, so I didn't like that. And so I went and found me another doctor to tell me what I wanted to hear. But my point that I want to make is that doctors and hospitals are okay. They have their value. They are a good asset. Far be it from the days of old in the worldwide Church of God where we claimed they were butcher houses and butchers that were in those butcher houses, hospitals being the butcher houses. I mean, that's ridiculous, very immature, and a skewed outlook toward the medical profession as well as the technological development that we have in the medical field. So, brethren, a balance came into play in the Systematic Theology Project, which is what that acronym stands for, the Systematic Theology Project, which is the basis of fundamental beliefs that the Church of God International has adopted in our understanding of the original apostolic teachings. That's where we started from. That's what Mr. Garner Ted Armstrong, in the secular side of the CGI's Genesis, who was the founder of CGI, although we do reference, of course, Jesus Christ and God the Father as the continuous thread from a long, sordid history and colorful history of the Church of God going back to the original apostles. That's another story. I can't digress. Maybe another time we'll talk about church history. But the point being is this Systematic Theology Project was the basis and of the fundamental explanations of a deeper unfolding of, unwrapping of our statement of beliefs, of which I trust many of you are already familiar with. Well, the Systematic Theology Project opens that up a little bit more deeper to give you the reasons, whys, and wherefores of why our statement of beliefs say and purport or advance what we believe to be those original apostolic teachings that we've adopted as an administration of the Church of God. And also, we understand too, and I introduced to you how Margie and I, when we first walked into the Worldwide Church of God back in about 71, 72, and about 1973, after about a year and a half in the organization of the Worldwide Church of God, Margie and I, with our two daughters being about 1 and 2 years old, started recognizing the fact that this organization was indeed more holistic, natural, food-oriented in the preservation of health and wellness. And we started mixing and mingling because we were viewed a little bit older than what we really were. We were only in our early 20s, but because we had 2 children, we were viewed a little bit older than that, and we got involved much more with the adult population of the congregation at that time of about 125 people. It grew to about 450, but that's another story too. My point being, though, is they introduced us to whole wheat. Make your own bread. Go out and find a farmer that'll give you raw milk. Make your own ice cream. Make your own butter. Get off the grid and eat naturally. You know, all these things. How about honey? Don't use sugar. Use honey in your tea and all this. And we started saying, oh, okay. I remember some of this when I used to do yoga, because back in the day, in my other lifetime, I did yoga for 2 years. And I hummed a little bit, and I would breathe in and breathe out. And that was another thing we also learned too, didn't we, last week? That there is good things that we need to be aware of. What is our medicine? Our best medicine for a human being is, my wife cheated, but what did she say it was? Food. But then I added water and oxygen. Water and oxygen and food. Not beer, whiskey, no. Water, food, and oxygen. And in yoga, I learned the holistic balance of body and soul, as they would say, or body and mind. Do this. All ready? Here we go now. We're going to breathe in our nose and out our mouth. Ready? Again. Again. One more time. No, I'm just kidding. But what yoga teaches you is that is the balance of body and mind. And I wouldn't doubt if some of you got a little bit lightheaded in doing that. Just 3 deep breaths and blowing out. Why? Because we all, by nature, in this life, at this time, in this environment, breathe shallow. That's why you need aerobic development and aerobic exercise. You need to train yourself to breathe deeply, because oxygen, brethren, is at the basis of good health. And we breathe too shallow by nature. And if I would have interrupted myself and asked you how you breathe in, many of you would have been just automatically, and you're probably just going, not even anywhere near taking in the necessary intake of oxygen. Mask. No, excuse me, interrupt myself. Taking in the oxygen levels necessary to oxygenate your blood so that you're clear-headed when you talk and when you think and go from one subject to another and recall and all the things that go along with good oxygenated blood. You see, that's important. That's really important, brethren. We learned about that last week, as I mentioned. And all of these things, in addition, we came to grips and realize that there are differences of how each and every one of us manage our health care. And I'll just use that term, our health care, in our pursuit for good health and wellness, and rightly so. Because we learned that though we are the temple of God, did we not also learn that we are the church? And you being the church, not the organizations, you don't answer to organizations, you answer to Jesus Christ. And when you answer to Jesus Christ, you're acknowledging the fact that you are the church of which Jesus Christ died for. He didn't die for this building. He died for you personally. We learned that at Passover, don't we? And He died for you and I because He wants us in His kingdom, because God is reproducing Himself without a doubt and bringing many sons and daughters to glory. That glory being the resurrection. Very important concepts to understand and learn, and thereby, because you are the church, and I know I'm going to extrapolate this from the context that this comes from, but nevertheless it's very appropriate in using the logic of the Holy Spirit being part and parcel to our being, because we are the temple. The Holy Spirit resides in us. We learned that the Father and Christ makes their abode in us. Remember John 14? We referenced John 14. And they tabernacle in us through the Parakletos. the Holy Spirit, which gives us our administration, life, on how we express the persona of God in us. Now that's an important concept. Remember, John the Apostle was livid when he wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John in his later years, because he saw that the Hellenists and the different Gnostics were perverting the truth of the original apostolic teachings that John knew. He was the last man standing, brethren. The last apostle left. They were all dead now. And there he was alone, and he's saying, look, I walked with the guy. I slept with the guy. I was with him. I heard his voice, and you are going in the wrong way. And he proceeded to explain, as you go into those epistles, and maybe one day we'll do that more deeply, line upon line, the fact remained, he was beginning to see the idea, the miraculous work of God in you, Christ in you, working through that Holy Spirit to make you godly and righteous, was indeed being abandoned. People were saying, you can't keep the commandments. You cannot stop sinning. Oh, but there is an element of effort that certainly is compelling, that causes all of us, once we recognize the importance of knowing that you are a container, a clay jar. Remember we use that term, a clay jar, a tabernacle. We learned that in the Feast of Tabernacles, of housing the very Spirit of God. And that's an important responsibility that all of us have, an incumbent responsibility. And therefore, we learn that in so doing, that we, being the church, have in each one of us different ways, don't we? The way you may handle something may not be necessarily the way I handle it. In a similar situation, I may take a whole different angle of approach. I remember when I used to train my service techs out in the field, and I would train them to install water systems, install pumps, glue pipe, Teflon, a nipple that goes into another type of fitting, whether it be a threaded T or a threaded elbow, on and on. And I would watch them do it. And I would think to myself, why are you doing that? But I had to teach myself, back off, Bill. Let him do it the way he's doing it, and then he'll learn. And sometimes, guess what? The teacher learned something from the new guy because he had a different perspective of it. And lo and behold, I learned something while I was training my newbie, as they would say. And so it works both ways in that regard. If you're open-minded enough to be able to, and if you're not getting the picture yet of what I'm talking about, remember I'm dropping nuggets along the way. I hope you're remembering them. I'm dropping little breadcrumbs along the way. If you're tolerant enough, accepting enough, you too can learn from each other rather than shutting each other off or down, ridiculing and criticizing on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and taking to task disrespectfully the ministry of when we talk about things that, well, just may not be real comfortable to hear. But yet the ministry is here, brethren, sometimes to make us uncomfortable, to get us thinking a little bit. And don't take it personal unless it applies. I was told a long time ago, if it don't apply, water off a duck's back. Remember that old saying? Don't worry about it. Don't get mad at the messenger just because you don't like the message. That's not very fair to yourself, and or whether or not maybe, just maybe, God is actually trying to get a message to, as they would say, to Garcia. You being Garcia. He's trying to get that message to you. But you're not listening. And so he tries different ways. And then instead you get mad at the minister because he's talking about this, that, or the other thing that you don't agree with or that you don't like, or that, why are you talking about that? Get back in the Bible. This is about the Bible. Because you see, there's a concept, brethren, that we all have to learn more deeply before we can even hear the hard things, which I haven't got to yet. I haven't got to it yet. We've touched on it. But now let's dig it a little deeper. Turn with me over here to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 for a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. The differences between each one of our personal administrations, and that's what I was talking about. Each one of us are a church. I don't want to belabor this point, but I want you to understand we all have our own ways of doing certain things. Once in a while, we'll find somebody that does something the same way we do it, and we like that because certainly that's more compatible with our rationale, with our reasoning, and so on. The point, though, is oftentimes that isn't the case. That's not the case. And we have to recognize certain differences between us and learn the techniques of toleration / and or acceptance without judging, begrudging, or jealousy that you've got something I don't. And Paul knew about this. God knew about this. Christ knew about this and inspired Paul to write to the Corinthian church, which was loaded with problems. Jealousies, envies, bickering, competition, ridicule. I mean, it was just, and tolerating sin, incest in the congregation. A man with his father's wife. We didn't know whether or not it was his biological mother or stepmother, but the point of it is he was having an affair with his father's wife. 1 Corinthians 5, you can read about that. And Paul said, throw the guy out. Turn him over to Satan. Boy, I wonder how many of us would be offended at Paul. Why? Did you hear what he said? Turn him over to Satan. Well, how judgmental is that, Paul? Could you imagine that? I mean, some of us would have that gumption to criticize the Apostle Paul in the advice he gave to the Corinthian congregation to throw that bum out. And maybe he'll learn his lesson with hard love. Well, that's not Christian. Why? We should be forgiving, compassionate, empathetic. But when you understand the concept of what was going on in 1 Corinthians 5, the guy was puffed up. He was braggadocious. He was proud about what he was doing. And he was blabbing it around the congregation, saying, hey, Rose, guess what? I've got an affair with my mom. I mean, how insane. So the Apostle Paul did the right thing. He said, the guy's obviously not listening, and you're tolerating it to the point where you're allowing it. And a little leaven, verse 4, or chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Oh, man, it's great stuff when you begin to understand the interaction of all of this. And it is very interactive, brethren. And here this principle of how we should learn to tolerate and accept one another is brought out in this chapter concerning spiritual gifts. And that's in verse 1. It lays down the context. Verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 12, verse 4. Now there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There's diversity of gifts, but the same Spirit. This is important to understand, and I'll give credit where credit is due, because my wife and I, we were talking, Margie and I, the other day, as I was preparing this, and I was rolling off some ideas to her to talk about some things that I was still kind of stuck on. And she brought up the understanding and the fact that, and it's very true, brethren, that we can have all kinds of diversity between us. We can have all kinds of different approaches toward A, B, and C, whatever they may be. But the fact of it is, we've got a commonality among us. A commonality that regardless of the fact of how you cut your grass, regardless of the fact of whether or not you drink a beer or not, regardless of the differences that we might have within the law of God, I know I can trust you, at least I should be able to, because we have this in common, that we understand Jesus Christ in a mutual fashion. So I should be able to leave my grandchildren with you at any time and feel perfectly secure. They're going to be well taken care of. They won't be abused. They won't be sold into sex slavery. When I come back, they'll still be there. And they'll still be smiling, not crying. On and on and on. You understand what I'm saying. And this is important, that we have this recognition that there is a commonality among all of us here, that Jesus Christ is our common source. And this is where Paul goes with this. Notice this, and I want to drive this point home by using these scriptures here. There are differences of administrations, but the same Lord, that's his point. And there are diversities of operations, but it is in the same God which works all in all. Now, I understand the context is gifts and talents and the differences between them, and how somebody might have the gift of tongues or the gift of prophecy or the gift of healing, and I don't. I've got something else. Maybe I've got, believe it or not, the gift of knowledge or whatever it may be. But the point that Paul's trying to make here is that we've got to learn to tolerate and accept those differences, and certainly, without a doubt, respect those differences. Respect them to allow, and understand this, God to have His way with His church. And that's important. And Paul continues on here with this theme where he says the manifestations, verse 7 now, this is 1 Corinthians 12, verse 7, but the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. For one is given wisdom, the other knowledge, verse 9, another healing, verse 10, prophecy, discerning of spirits, different kinds of tongues, and interpretations of tongues, verse 11. All this works one way, the self-same Spirit, dividing to every man severally as He will, for as the body is one. There's the concept. Though we have all these differences, all these likes and dislikes amongst us that are different from me, different from you, because my conscience doesn't square with this, and your conscience doesn't square with that. But yet I have still a license to believe what I'm believing or doing what I'm doing because I'm talking in terms that this is all accepted and lawful within the realm of God's requirements. I'm not talking about going out and committing adultery. I'm not talking about going out, and killing people. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about in the context that we are operating within the law of God, but there are still differences among us. There are still differences among us. Some of you might like gardening. I wouldn't garden for the life of me. I'm a city slicker. I'll eat your food. I'll come around at harvest time. I'm not a cook. I'm not gifted in cooking. And believe me, if I cooked something, you would probably not eat it. But now, is that a criticism? How do we translate this? Oh, Watson can't cook for a darn. I'm not going. I'm not going. Oh, that guy can't speak. I don't like him. I'm not going. I'll never forget the time I was in Panama City Beach at the Feast of Tabernacles. I got up early because I had to. And I was walking around the facility, making sure all the televisions in the tent were right and everything. Everything was hooked up for the remotes and what have you. We had about 900 people coming there at that time of this year in the 1990s. And so there I was outside, and a guy comes around in a golf cart. I won't tell you his name, but he comes in a golf cart, and he's dressed in shorts. He was out early, taking, some swings and driving some golf balls and stuff. And I said, he stopped. He said, "Hey, Bill." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Who's speaking today?" I said, "So-and-so." "Oh, okay." Meaning he didn't want to go. He wasn't going to hear it. He's not going to waste his time listening to that guy because he don't like him. He doesn't like him. Paul had the same problem with Corinthian church. Read it from chapters 1 and 2. Same thing. Apollos, some like Apollos, others like Paul, some like the others. And Paul said, "I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you." He had other issues, the church. They just couldn't seem to get along and understand the differences with respect and benefit from each other's gifts, you see. And Paul continues on here, and he says, "For by one Spirit," this is verse 13 now, chapter 12, 1 Corinthians, "For by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles." Whether we be Jews or Gentiles, it doesn't matter what ethnicity. You could be from Kenya, you could be from the Congo, you could be from Thailand, I don't care where you're from, India, whether it be in even northern Idaho, doesn't matter. Wherever and whatever you may be, it does not matter because we all have Christ in common. So why would you go on Facebook, Instagram? Why would you go in some of these mediums and criticize people that are trying to teach? If you don't like it, or you have something with the subject and the approach that was taken, why not email them at billw.cgi.org and talk about it? That's what we should do. BillW@cgi.org. Don't need to go public and say, "Oh, that guy is full of it. He doesn't know what he's talking about." I was kidding everybody today. I brought in this yellow blanket because we're going to remove a pew, and I said it's for my security blanket because I'm insecure about giving some of this stuff. Not really. But I know that some of this stuff that we talk about, and we have to talk about it, brethren, because of the environment that we're in, is hard to hear because not everybody is on the same page with this information. And what information am I talking about? I'm talking about both sides of the coin. The conflicting information that we have for all of us. For all of us. And the question is, how do we get along in the midst of this environment that we have with all this conflicting information and individuals putting their foot down because according to Romans 14, verse 23, what is not of belief, pistis, / faith, or what is not of faith, as it's written, pistis, parentheses, belief, is sin. And if I'm going to do that, it's legitimate. I think I'm going to sin. So what gives you the right to coerce me, penalize me, impede my freedoms, to force me and steer me into something that violates my conscience? Am I making sense? So this is important. It's hard to hear, but it's the real world we're dealing with. And each and every one of us have a responsibility on how we're going to adjust to it, how we're going to size to it, how we're going to basically amalgamate with it. What are the adjustments necessary? Well, I'll get on Facebook. I'll tell that guy what I want to tell him. That's how I'm going to solve this. I hope that he gets fired. So those are not the ways. Paul, he continues on here and dropping down. He uses a narrative here in verses 15, 1 Corinthians 12, 15 down through about 25, the narrative of the eye being part of the body and the ear being part of the body. And just because the ear is not the eye doesn't mean it's not part of the body, because they all work together. They're all merged together. They amalgamate and they work together as a team and they make one big unit. That's the body. And so my eyes tell my brain what's going on so I don't walk over this thing and knock it down. And my mouth, I can hear my tone and my voice, and my ears, I hear, and so forth. I got 5 senses. I can smell. I got all this stuff, and all this information is coming in and processing. In some cases, they claim your subconscious is processing billions of bits of information every minute, every second in some regards on what you're actually comprehending and seeing. It's an amazing, amazing system, the body, and how it works, and how all the parts are integrated into giving you this ability to administer your persona, to be able to express your personality, to be able to connect with other people. And some are better at it than others. Others are more geared toward working with things, machines, books, items that are just, they're not flesh and blood. Others are better with flesh and blood, and they deal with that. Does that mean I should be jealous of that person or jealous of the other guy? I remember my brother-in-law, Steve. I didn't know a car. Steve taught me how to tune up my car. Steve dated Margie's sister, Barbara, and then ultimately married about 48 years ago, Steve? 48 years, I think, or so, 47. Margie and I, we married a little bit sooner, but she was older. Point being, I can remember when the kids were in the backyard, they were all playing, and Steve's back there training me, Bill, these are points. This is a condenser. Bill, this is a distributor cap. You take the cap off, and there are the points. And I had a 69 Camaro, and Steve would be patient teaching me how to go ahead and tune my car up, because it saved me money, because I didn't have, any money at all. I barely had a nickel in a can, as they would say. So he was saving me money, showing me how I can take care of my car. He showed me how to oil change my car. I didn't know where oil filter. What's an oil filter? And he taught me all that. He took me back under the car and says, there it is. That's what you got to do. Here's the wrench. It's got a strap on it. How's that a wrench? That's got a strap on it. You guys know what I'm talking about if you ever changed your oil. My point is, we're all we're all gifted in certain ways and different ways. And Paul is trying to illustrate this by virtue of the parts of the body. Verse 25 now, dropping down, 1 Corinthians 12, verse 25. That there should be no schisms. And that word means no division in the body. He goes through this narrative, 15 through 24, explaining how everything works so together. And then the point is, so there should be no schisms. If you want the body to work right, you need to give each other space to be themselves. And so he says here in verse 25, there should be no schisms in the body, no divisions, but that the members should have the same key word here, Greek word care, translated care in the English, means to basically have care or be thoughtful or be caring. Oh yeah, that guy, man, he don't know what he's talking about. This guy, he needs to be off. Is there some way we can shut him down? Hey, how about the CGI? We used to have a guy dogging us on television back in the day where he would have a big group of documents and papers that illustrated what we believe. No Christmas, no Easter, no immortal soul, that we didn't believe in the Trinity of all things. And he would chase us to prevent us from being able to conduct business with television stations to put the armor of God on. And that's what his way of trying to stop what he believed to be wrong. And sadly, there are people within God's church that do not respect the efforts and sometimes the teachings of ministers who do go into areas that sometimes is just uncomfortable. And we haven't even got uncomfortable yet. That'll be part 3. I'm still laying groundwork here, brethren, because sometimes, based on what I see, we don't get this fundamental information at the start here. And this 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is a very important chapter because as he proceeds here, he says in verse 26, and whether one member suffers, all members suffer with it. Or one member be honored, all members rejoice with it. Dropping down to 31 for the sake of time. But covet, desire, that's what that means. Desire earnestly the best gifts, and yet show I unto you a more excellent way. And he launches into what all of us are, many of us are well aware of, familiar with, 1 Corinthians 13, that we all know to be what? The love chapter. I use that chapter in wedding ceremonies, when I do weddings for people. 1 Corinthians 13, what is love? There's your definition from God through the Apostle Paul. You want to know what love is? That's your definition of love. Build your life around it, brethren. You don't need a how-to book from some psychologists. You don't need to go over into psychology today and try to read an article about the definition of what love is. The definition of what love is very simple. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 1 through verses 13. And it's interesting because what Paul is doing here is he is basically saying, if you don't have love, you don't have anything. You could know everything about the Bible, everything about God, but if you don't have love, it's worthless. Why is it worthless? Because you won't respect each other. You won't give each other the benefits of the doubt they deserve, to allow God to have His way with you individually as a congregation. Because if I keep getting into your way and become an obstacle in your development, shame on me as a minister. And that's why the CGI's ministry is not designed to dictate. It's not designed to control. It's not designed to develop codependent Christians. The CGI ministry, which we believe to be what the Bible claims the ministry should be, is guides to the salvation that's being worked within you. And we are servant elders to you, facilitating with us at the bottom, not at the top, at the bottom of the pyramid, supporting, and facilitating the brethren to grow in grace and knowledge, and hopefully translating that into application of real fruit, love, empathy, compassion, caring, courtesy, concern. People call me at home from this congregation. I'm so glad. I give you a hand for that. Bill, what do you think? Should I come to church today? Because they read the rules of the house. And they want me to, help them through making a decision. That's okay. But what I say, I'm just spotlighting the courtesy of the phone call to begin with, rather than just showing up at church going, "Hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm glad to see you." And you're coming with a cold, or you got the sneezes, and you're spreading your germs all over the place. That's good, brethren. What does that show us? That some of us have courtesy. We have consideration. And what does that do? That shows care. That's what it's all about. Caring for one another so that we can adjust to the differences we have. Turn with me. I'm going to continue to hammer this theme. Romans 14. Romans chapter 14. But in this case, we're going to go to verse 1. Romans 14 and in verse 1. Him that is weak in the faith, receive you. This means basically he's not strong, but not to doubtful disputations. In other words, bring him in, welcome him. You never know why they're here. They could be here just for one simple thing. They know the Sabbath is the day to meet. Everything else, they don't know anything. They don't know anything about immortality of the soul, Christmas, Easter. They don't even know you don't keep Easter. And they came out of the Baptist church, let's just say in this little example, and they firmly believe that the Trinity is defining the nature of God. And you have no idea where this person is. And not only that, but they don't drink. How do you approach this person that's a newbie coming into our audience? How do you approach anyone if you're going to, using the modern vernacular, red pill them? How are you going to red pill somebody about the apostolic teachings? The apostolic teachings that you believe. The red pilling comes from, the matrix, blue pill, red pill. Take the blue pill, you stay where you're at. Take the red pill, you never can come back. Had a guy tell me about that, but it wasn't a blue and red pill. My point in all of this is very important, brethren. Very important that we have to be considerate and courteous and careful in dealing with one another, without a doubt. Why? Because we're all different. We're all different. Verse 2, chapter 14, book of Romans. For one believes that he may eat all things, another who is weak eats only herbs. This is the proverbial vegetarian against the meat eater. Or let's extrapolate it and say even unclean meats. And like we did here in the early days, back in 1984, 85, we had a gentleman that was, he was just the biggest-hearted guy, and he was a big, tall guy, and he basically was a graduate of Bob Jones University. You know who I'm talking about. And he was really a nice guy, and he would constantly bring in pork chops and all kinds of unclean foods to our potlucks after church. And then he'd wonder why nobody would eat it. We went to a combined service back in 1984, 85, after we left the Worldwide Church of God in 83, and stopped on the way back after combined services in Columbus, Ohio, at a smorgasbord, and he got himself some frog legs. And he was eating frog legs while we were all with him. Finally, after talking to him over and over, Wayne Hendricks as well doing his best to try to get him to comprehend. We just don't do this stuff. And why don't you stop bringing it? But he didn't. He was hard-headed. And that was just the way he was. And finally, one day he came to Sabbath services, and he was real tall, and he put his arm on my shoulder, like I was a stool. He's looking down at me and he says, "Bill, had something really happen to me last night. I think it was a message from God." All the sermons that he heard, all of the private discussions between Wayne and I with him, he finally comes to services and he says, "Bill, I think God's talking to me." I said, "Well, why is that?" And I'll just say, "Mark, why is that?" And he said, Well, I was eating a ham sandwich last night watching TV, and I about choked and died. I said, no kidding. He said, yeah. I said, you know what? I think God was talking to you. But whatever, shakes your tail, whatever gets finally through to you, God be praised. As I've often said, I don't have any misunderstandings about me up here flapping my jaw thinking I'm going to change your mind about something. I would be naive. I'm getting too aged for that. I know where change comes from, brethren, because it comes from where it comes from me. And it comes from me between my ears, in the privacy of my own study, in the privacy of my own prayers, contemplating and maybe meditating on what I heard at Sabbath services and taking some of the things that make sense to me and putting to the side things that maybe I just don't understand yet or don't apply to me in the context it was brought up in. And I can't make that connection. That's okay. That's okay. If you can walk away from a sermon and have something you can take home to and work with, more power to you to work with it, because that's what it's all about. All of us helping one another privately, even off the grid during the week maybe with each other, as we go from house to house, learning how each other lives and how each other thinks and what each other does during the week. But in this case, he continues on and he says, let not him, now notice this, let not him, this is the point that he's trying to make. Verse 3, Romans 14, verse 3, let not him that eats despise him that doesn't, and let not him which doesn't judge him that does. So what's that mean? That means if you do it, it's okay with me. And we're talking about within the law of God. Don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about, oh, you're committing adultery? Oh, you robbed that bank? No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that we're talking within God's law, within the allowance of God's law, and you're doing something that I wouldn't do. So guess what? Am I going to criticize and ridicule you? No. No. If it makes you feel good to go out in your garden, Frank Gardens, hey, more power to you. I'm not going to be there. Now, if I lived close to Frank and he needed some help, maybe I would go over there if I had the time to help him do whatever he had to do. But I'm not going to invest the time and effort of rototilling the ground, planting seeds, doing all the stuff that goes on, weeding during the summer. I'm not going to do that. I just know me. I don't like it. And that's just the way I'm built. I didn't like working on cars. But I did because Steve was teaching me and I needed to save the money, so I was compelled, I was motivated. It was dollars and cents to me. And I guess really when it comes down to it, sometimes that's what it does come down to is dollars and cents. But at any rate, verse 4 now, as we close this up here, because we're just going to go to this verse here. Who are you then that judges another man's servant? Whoa! Did you catch it? Who am I to judge you? I don't own you, and you don't own me. Why is that? Because God owns you. So far be it from me to criticize you, because if I'm criticizing you, I just may be criticizing the work of God within your administration, within your persona, within what God is doing for you privately, as you come and tumble to the values God is trying to teach you about. So, guess what? Paul says here, look, get this understanding here. Who are you to judge another man's servant? And we are. We are God's servants. That's why I'm only a guide. I don't own you. I'm a guide. In the ministry, we are guides to the salvation that is within you. That's all. That's all. Take it or leave it. I hope it's a helpful guide. Granted, and admittedly, there are guides out there that are, in some cases, less than favorable. Beware of false preachers. Remember that presentation? Beware of false preachers for whatever genders they may be working. But the point of it is, in this case, Paul is saying to his own master, he stands or falls. Yes, He shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. And that's the point. And so, I want to share with you just some differences here. I want you to think about this. How would you personally tolerate and or accept? How would you avoid judging, begrudging, and being jealous if you found yourself face to face with the following descriptions of circumstances I'm going to share with you for a moment? Some call each other, well, Sister Ashley. Well, hello there, Brother Jordan. Well, how you doing there, Sister Karen? Amen there, Brother Joey. Hey, Pastor Hendricks. Deacon George. I've had congregations where I've gone, they didn't even use my name. They say, hey, Pastor, come here. Address me by my function? That's interesting. How do you deal with this? Blessed and happy is the man who does never walk astray. You know, there's congregations in CGI that do that. You're going to walk in, do song services, you're going to see people doing that. You're going to see people doing that. Amen! Can I have an amen? Now, is that wrong? I mean, I'm not built that way, as you've already probably assumed, but there are some preachers that are built that way in CGI. Get on internet. I didn't like that guy. He called for too many amens. I only wanted 2. He called for 10. But it gets a lot worse than that, of course. Some differ with foods. Types, kinds, natural, synthetics, salts and sugars. Some will go out to a restaurant on the Sabbath day. Others won't. Others won't. What do you do with that? What do you? Don't ask me. I've got my own dealings, but I'm not sharing any of that with you, if you already noticed. I'm staying neutral on this. I want you to answer these questions in your mind, between your ears. How would you deal with this? Predicated on what you do. Come on, let's go have a beer. No. All right. How about a mixed drink? No. All right, wine. No. Oh man, I've got this rash, and I got to get rid of it somehow. Well, here, take this cannabis derivative. It's called CBD. It doesn't have any THC in it. You're not going to get high on it. It's a cream. It's a gel. No, I think I'll stick with what was prescribed and take this salve with all this testosterone. Or not testosterone, what's it called? Steroids. Steroids. I'll take the cream with steroids. Oh, man, I'm coming down with something, I know. Well, here, just go in the bathtub, get it warm, lukewarm, put about 3 or 4 scoops of mustard powder in the water, then raise the temperature up to your tolerance and sweat like a hog. No. Give me my NyQuil. Give me my Excedrin. I've got a prescription for that. I'll take my pills that my doctor gave me. Oh, you have an earache. Well, here, take this pain killer. It'll get rid of it. No, I think I'll cut an onion in half and on the flat side, warm it in the oven and put it on my kid's ear. You laugh. You laugh. No, No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. You know, I've got this pain, and marijuana, cannabis, is legalized in Ohio, so I'm going to go down and get a prescription from my doc, and I'm going to take it because I know grass really kills pain. Been there, done that. Yeah. And now it's legal. I won't get arrested. No, I ain't going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But it's legal, it's natural, and it does kill pain. And you do get high because that has THC in it. Some are more regular with their financial support, and others are more regular in their attendance. Some are not. Some would own a gun, maybe 2 or 3. Go out shooting for game and hunting, ultimately. Others wouldn't get near a gun. You have a gun? You go out shooting? What are you, some kind of a criminal? And there are people that have different perspectives on guns and armament and how they approach it within God's church. Within God's church. Some are more compliant with, and I'm going to use the word, some are more compliant with mandates. Others are not and willing to put their jobs on the line. Some would never consider going out on the street and, quote, peacefully protest an abortion clinic, a government issue that is perceived to be overreach and encroaching. Others would. Some would commit themselves to congregations more thoroughly. Others have other interests. Some would keep the Sabbath differently. Don't watch TV. Or if I do, it's only the news. Or it's the way I keep it that doesn't and isn't compatible with me. Why? Because I don't have any kids. Oh, you've got 2 kids, 5 and 8 years old? That puts a whole different dynamic on keeping Sabbath. I've got 1 wife, just 1. And she's not in the church. You're going where on the Sabbath? Yeah, I'm going there. This building, brethren, 1835, built in 1835. We had a historical marker presented here, and one of the known facts about this church is it was a congregation of about 20 people back then when they built this church, and they were activists. They were involved in a political issue, a political policy, but they took it on because they knew it was immoral, and it was about human trafficking, slavery. So the question, the pastor stands up one, in this case Sunday, and says to the congregation, folks, there are people in the South that are coming up here, runaway slaves, and they need a place to go. Now, I know it's illegal, and I know that you could be arrested for it, and I know that you might be able to lose your property and all that, but I don't see any way around the fact we need to help these people. It's immoral. The government is allowing slavery. So we need to get active in this political issue because it's immoral. It's a spiritual issue. You in with me or are you not? What would you do, brethren? Would you be involved in the Underground Railroad? Or would you passively sit back and allow human trafficking, because that's the modern terminology of slavery today, same thing was human trafficking, go on uninhibited, even when you could maybe do something about it? I think there's something in the book of James, isn't there, that if you know to do good and can do it and don't, is a sin. James. That's the other definition of sin. Transgression of God's law, as I mentioned before at the outset of this presentation. And of course, going against your conscience. What is not of faith is sin. And of course, to know to do good and not to do it when you have the wherewithal to be able to do it. That too is sin. Brethren, these are questions that Paul's bringing up in 1 Corinthians 12 and of course in Romans 14 that all of us have to deal with. And as I mentioned before, the fears on how we handle things, that is our choices, and we all have different choices according to our faith and our fears and the information we're comfortable with. Those are the things that oftentimes demand, or what you could say, steer our actions. My meniscus again. When I went to the doc, my action was not so much when he told me I wouldn't run, get a bike, you're too old to run. When he told me that, that wasn't fearful that I was running, that I wouldn't run again. I wasn't fearing that I wasn't going to run again. I was disappointed, this guy, knowing what he should know, that I thought he should know, with all the technology that we've got, how can I not run? And he was older. He was probably in his 60s. So I went to another hospital, as I mentioned to you before, I'm not going to belabor it, found a doctor, young guy, 38, 40, 42, I don't know how old, buffed, athletic, I could see, told me exactly what he was going to do. When I asked him, can I run again? He said, run again? You weren't running 6 weeks. And as I told you, I'm running. The point being, we decide on what we do by either our faith, our fears, or what we're comfortable in the information we gather. And once we achieve these, one or the other, we act. We act. And brethren, we're living in a time, a day and age, where fears are being exploited. So we're going to leave it at that right now. And we'll pick it up in part 3 of this particular subject of wealth, or not wealth,